Honorable members, it is certainly an honor and a pleasure again for me to address you on the topic of administration and financing of Parliament. With the widespread proliferation of democracy and incessant global calls for adherence to the principles of good governance, parliaments are ever more pressed to deliver on their constitutional commitments. Now, the issue of parliamentary autonomy is what one might describe as cross-disciplinary, since it touches on all aspects of the organization and functioning of Parliament. In this era, parliaments are turning their attention to more effective administrative and financial management because of globalization and the expectation placed on parliaments to deliver quality goods and services in democratic countries. For these reasons, Parliament is led to look at its internal governance structures and existing relationships with the executive, with a view to re-engineering its processes and consider total autonomy of its finances. In this global environment, many parliaments are moving towards establishing corporate bodies as a way to better utilize available resources, while at the same time enhancing their independence from the executive. In countries where such bodies have been established, Parliament is better able to assert its independence and ensure that adequate resources, both financial and administrative, are made available. Autonomy would enable Parliament to discharge its functions more effectively and efficiently, while allowing members of Parliament to exercise control over the prioritization of the delivery of services by the parliamentary service. In order to accomplish this task, parliaments the world over are looking to the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association and the World Bank Institute for advice on the establishment of corporate bodies or support in bringing greater efficacy to existing corporate governance arrangements. It is against this backdrop that my presentation seeks to examine the administration and financing of Parliament, with specific focus on the concept of financial autonomy for legislatures. In this way, we can then examine how Parliament could use its influence to create a better understanding amongst members of the executive as to the proper relationship with the Parliament and the crucial importance of pursuing and attaining parliamentary independence. Let us examine the concept of financial autonomy for parliaments. Honorable members, financial control may rest with the Parliament or the executive, or there can be a collaborative model where Parliament determines the budget in consultation with the executive. When Parliament does not have financial independence, there is always the danger that the executive will be encouraged to exercise undue control and influence over expenditure to the detriment of the parliamentary process. Many parliaments are funded on a legislative basis, with funding automatically provided each year, while others must have their full funding voted each year. A number of parliaments operate on a combination of the two funding models. According to a 1998 Inter-Parliamentary Union study, the preparation of the draft budget constitutes a determining phase for gauging the autonomy of a parliament. The study found that there are assemblies which drew up their own budget without government intervention, while others required approval from the Ministry of Finance. The IPU study, however, goes on to state that autonomy does not preclude cooperation with the executive. There is, however, an expectation that Parliament will adhere to the highest standards of accountability. In a number of international settings, the executive has established financial accounting and reporting standards that are regarded as the gold standards. These standards have been adopted by many parliaments for use in the financial operation or their financial operations. There are 3 stages in the parliamentary annual financial cycle. 1, securing the budget. 2, deploying and monitoring of resources. And 3, reporting on and accounting for expenditure. The roles of the Speaker, the corporate body, and the clerk are central to good governance. The corporate body sets the strategic priorities, determining the range and standards of services to be provided to Parliament. The clerk is responsible for the preparation of the estimates, which are then endorsed by the corporate body. The clerk, as accounting officer, is responsible for the deployment of resources, paying due regard to the strategic priorities set by the corporate body. It is for the clerk to put in place financial controls and to report to the corporate body at regular intervals on actual expenditure against the resources appropriated for parliamentary purposes. There is always the danger that Parliament will be criticized for not spending resources that could have been redirected to pay for essential public services. Regular monitoring of expenditure needs to take place so that the corporate body can make informed decisions about the early release of funds to the executive. Let me point out that Parliament is often the prime target for critics on the issue of the use of public funds. It is therefore of paramount importance that Parliament includes transparency in its financial arrangements. The extent to which parliamentary spending is reported publicly varies, particularly in terms of the detailed expenses of parliamentarians. It is for this reason that Parliament needs to ensure that the remuneration package for parliamentarians is determined by an independent process. In Trinidad and Tobago, it is done by the Salary Review Commission, with public reporting based on the categories of allowances recommended by this independent body. The clerk, as the accounting officer, is also responsible for the preparation of Parliament's annual accounts, which in most instances are externally audited before being laid before the House. As part of the accounting process, the clerk provides a statement of internal control that gives that assessment. I now turn to the importance of parliamentary independence. Independence in the parliamentary context is provided for at three levels: institutional, financial, and administrative autonomy. In countries where there are written constitutions, the principle of parliamentary independence is often institutionalized in these bodies. Where no written constitution exists, institutional autonomy and the separation of powers can be established. Alternatively, parliamentary autonomy can be expressed in legislation, establishing corporate bodies which would be responsible for providing Parliament with the necessary property, staff, and services. Administrative autonomy is about self-determination with regard to the nature and level of services to be provided to Parliament. Honourable members, the experience of the United Kingdom and other Commonwealth countries supports the view that administrative independence and accountability is best achieved through the establishment of parliamentary corporate bodies. In a democracy, Parliament, as the representative of the people, must be free to set its own agenda and govern its own proceedings. A fundamental purpose of Parliament, therefore, is to hold the executive to account. For this reason, Parliament should be able to discharge its constitutional responsibilities free from government interference. As a consequence, the independence of Parliament is an essential requirement to good parliamentary governance. Additionally, operational autonomy should not act as a barrier to the fostering of good relations with the executive, because this is vital if legislation and public sector policies are to be apt for that purpose. Implementing the principle of autonomy in practice involves the following. 1. Parliamentary responsibility for its own staffing. Parliament must be responsible for its own staffing. It also means control over its own budget. And it means the organization of its own business. As to the first of these three, submissions from the Indian and Canadian parliaments respectively underline the importance of parliamentary staff being independent of the central public or civil service. Here what an example from India on this matter. To effectively carry out its function within the framework of the separation of powers, it is essential that Parliament should have an independent secretariat. Parliament must have an independent secretariat. That is what happens in India, with the underlying objective of ensuring the concept of executive and administrative accountability to Parliament. Separate and independent secretariats for the two houses of Parliament have been provided for in Article 98 of the Constitution of India. So they are independent secretariat in the Constitution of India for the two houses of Parliament in India. In Canada, and I quote, a Parliament's effectiveness is in large measure a reflection of the mechanisms and resources that ensure its independence and autonomy. The operational independence of the Canadian Parliament is provided for in the Constitution and by legislation that guarantees that the Senate, the House of Commons, and the Library of Parliament each have access to a non-partisan professional staff distinct from the public service. While public servants in the bureaucracy may move from one department to another through the course of their careers, parliamentary staff tend to make their career serving Parliament in their respective institution. End of quote. This model of professional parliamentary service, with its own organization and career structure, is now becoming widely accepted in parliaments worldwide. It recognizes that serving Parliament is a distinctive activity where, given the nature of party competition, the norms of non-partisanship and professional discretion are at a special premium. Parliamentary autonomy here also includes the development of independent legal counsel to advise Parliament on legal dimensions of government policy as well as on legislative drafting. So you need independent legal counsel to make sure the Parliament is independent of the executive. You don't want any advice from the Attorney General. You don't want that in a Parliament. In keeping with this, the House of Commons Commission of the United Kingdom reaffirmed the strategic role of the corporate body in providing responsive and accountable parliamentary services. As a consequence, greater levels of intervention by the corporate body in determining what Parliament requires were recommended. Subsequently, corporate bodies were established in the Scottish Parliament. Imagine Scotland has its own independent parliamentary arrangement. Northern Ireland Assembly and the National Assembly for Wales, vesting all responsibility for financial and administrative matters in the newly incorporated parliamentary bodies. All those places within the United Kingdom, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales have their own corporate body that generates financial and administrative independence and autonomy. New Zealand's Parliamentary Service Commission revisited the issues of independence, proper resources for members of Parliament, and the need for effective accountability in 1998. This review led to the enactment of the New Zealand Parliamentary Service Act of 2000, which strengthened the role of the parliamentary corporate body. In India, the independence of Parliament is enshrined in the Constitution. This stipulation empowers the Parliament to make laws regulating the recruitment and terms and conditions of service for the parliamentary staff. Thus, the parliamentary budget is voted by Parliament with no sanctions exercised by the executive. Parliament votes for its own budget. Parliament approves its own budget, and no executive could alter a comma or full stop once that budget is approved by the Parliament, by the parliamentarians. It goes to the Minister of Finance, and he will just incorporate that in his budget and present it to the Parliament. That is independence of the Parliament, I should say. Further, staff of the Jamaican Parliament, my colleague here, are civil servants, with the clerk and deputy clerk being statutory appointments. For budgetary purposes, Parliament remains part of the mainstream government system, requiring the Minister of Finance approval of the parliamentary votes. What obtains in Jamaica obtains in Trinidad and Tobago. We are about to move towards establishing a parliamentary service that will have financial, administrative autonomy for the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago. Let me further point out that effective oversight of the corporate affairs of Parliament will only be achieved where there is a strong relationship between the Speaker, members of the corporate body, and the parliamentary staff. Parliament's ability to assert its independence is potentially constrained by the political strength of the executive. If you have a strong executive and a weak legislature, then you have an hijacking of the Parliament. You have to have a strong legislature to keep any executive, no matter what the complexion of that executive may be, under manners and in check. And it is in the interest of democracy that we promote that philosophy. In fact, it has been argued that there has been a substantial shift in power in here from the legislative to the executive arm of government. Some suggest that in the context of a majority parliament, the cabinet is no longer responsible to the House, but that the House seems instead to be responsible to the cabinet. The dynamic in a minority government situation like one experienced in Canada in 2005. So some countries are seeing a situation where the cabinet and the government is in charge of the House rather than the House being in charge of the cabinet. And the only way to correct that is having a strong separation of powers where the independence of the Parliament can be established in law, not by old talk, but it must be law passed by the both houses. One of the most effective ways of protecting the legislature from being unduly influenced by the executive is through the notion of public interest. In most parliaments, public interest has developed as a core value that influences the behaviors of both parliamentarians and parliamentary staff. There is a need for Parliament to develop a spirit where the Speaker, the corporate body, and the parliamentary staff have a shared understanding of the constitutional position of Parliament. The neutrality, as my friend said earlier, of the Speaker is pivotal in maintaining the integrity of the Parliament. The Speaker presides over all procedural business and in most cases is chair of the corporate body and provides leadership and direction to the parliamentary staff. The role of the corporate body and its relationship with the parliamentary staff is very critical. The corporate body should act as a collective basis in the best interest of all the members of the legislature and the Parliament and not on a partisan or governmental basis. Even where members of the corporate body are members of the governing party, they are also members of Parliament, usually with a strong sense of institutional loyalty to the institution. So even though you are a member of a body and you are from the government, your loyalty must always be with the institution called the Parliament. The clerk, as the chief advisor to the Speaker and head of the parliamentary staff, has a central role in ensuring that the Parliament is adequately served. The Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago is about, as I said, to embark on this journey where we are going to establish a parliamentary service authority that will bring into being for the first time since independence financial, administrative autonomy with a strong and independent secretariat. And that should happen by the end of 2014. 14. Let me rush to my conclusion. Whether defined by written constitution, by legislation, or by custom and practice, or even a combination of all three, an essential component of effective management for parliaments is determined by its ability to control the resources it requires to meet the legislative responsibilities of its operations. It can therefore be seen that when parliaments are managed through a corporate body or entity, the level of their autonomy relates to 1, the ability to identify and gain the financial resources required, the independence of staff from external control, particularly from the executive, the authority of Parliament to ensure the security of its members and infrastructure, the inclusivity of membership of the corporate body that sets it aside from party politics, and the capacity to win public confidence through the involvement of independent assessment, the delivery of ethics compliance, and the transparent reporting of progress in meeting their objectives. There is need then for parliaments to attain the autonomy required to reflect it in delivering one of the three organs of a modern democratic state. What is clear, though, is that the powers, relationships, and responsibilities between the Speaker, the parliamentary corporate body, and the Clerk of the House are crucial because it is these that most influence effective parliamentary control of administration and finance. I wish to thank you.
Thank you, Speaker Mark. Mrs. Cooke.
In 2005, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association facilitated a study group on the topic Administration and Financing of Parliament, from which a report emanated. This report, in my view, proposes a model for best practice. I quote from the introduction of the report: "Increasingly, parliaments are turning their attention to the challenge of managing more effectively their administration and financing. With the global expansion of democracy, there is a greater expectation placed on parliaments to deliver on their constitutional commitments. This has led parliaments to look more critically at the internal governance structures and prevailing relationships with the executive. Many parliaments are moving towards establishing corporate bodies as a way of better utilizing the resources available, while at the same time enhancing their independence from the executive. In cases where such bodies have been established, there is evidence that Parliament is better able to assert its independence and ensure that adequate resources are made available. This, in turn, enables Parliament to discharge its functions more effectively, while also allowing members to exercise appropriate control over the prioritization of the delivery of services by the parliamentary service." Quote, end of quote. The basis for these assertions is that the legislature is an independent arm of government with responsibility to provide oversight of the executive. As such, Parliament should be able to discharge its responsibilities without interference from the executive. It is submitted in the report that these responsibilities cannot be discharged if the Parliament does not have institutional, financial, and administrative autonomy from the executive. And I'll just briefly speak about the Jamaican case, which is a classic case of how not to. The Parliament is executive-led, and it appears that instead of the executive being accountable to Parliament, Parliament is accountable to the executive. At present, there is no financial independence. For budget purposes, the Parliament remains a part of the mainstream government system, requiring the Ministry of Finance approval for the annual budget. As a matter of fact, I should add that when the budget call circular goes out, like every other ministry, the Parliament is given a ceiling over which they cannot go. And what I should say too is that even where the ceiling is provided, that we don't always get what is, what the ceiling that they have proposed. It doesn't always end up in the estimates like that. The internal audit of the Parliament is undertaken by the Ministry of Finance. The clerk does not have her own internal auditor. And the Director of Finance, and this is a historical thing, the Director of Finance is a member of the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service staff. And this came about because some 20 years ago there was what we call the furniture scandal, where furniture was purchased on, purportedly on behalf of members of cabinet. And what came out of the whole thing is that one minister in particular, just without paying attention to what he was signed off on something. Somebody other than him benefited from this thing, that, purchase of expensive carpeting and chandelier. I wasn't working there at the time, but I remember the furniture scandal. But the details of it, I'm not certain of, but it involved expensive furnishings for the minister's home, purportedly for the minister's home. And the minister's signature was on the document, but it was evident that the things did not end up in his home. So because of this furniture scandal, a director of finance was put in the Parliament from the Ministry of Finance and Planning, and this has obtained since some early 90s, I believe this was. And it is a challenge because this is somebody who we have performance appraisal. The clerk is not the person who does the performance appraisal, yet this is the person who is supposed to be working as Director of Finance under the clerk. So that is one of the challenges that we have with this lack of separation of powers and this lack of autonomy. Our Constitution makes provision for the office of clerk and the office of deputy clerk, and we are recruited, and our terms and conditions are supposed to be signed off by a commission, which comprises the Speaker of the House as chairman, the President of the Senate, and the Minister of Finance, or his designee. What happens in practice is that the appointment is made by the commission, but the terms are already established by the public service. We are locked in. We have a post that is comparable to a permanent secretary's post, and so we are forever locked into a permanent secretary's salary, and again, because of the lack of autonomy. So in practice, what happens, it's just that all it is that the only thing that really is different is that we are not subject to the public service regulations. It's the recommendation of this commission, and the Governor General signs off straight on it. So that's just the clerk and the deputy clerk. But the rest of the staff are civil servants in every sense of the word, and they're subject to the public service regulations. We have problems with issues of discipline because when we're dealing with our staff, they're subject to the public service regulations, so you can't hire and fire and discipline and whatever. We have to rely on the public service standards and regulations and all these things. Ministry of Finance and Planning, we have to go to them for our posts to be classified and the establishment of posts. So we have a fight every time we think that we need X for our establishment and they don't think we need it. It's a problem. We think we need somebody at a senior level. In our sergeant at arms, I had a big fight and I ended up having to compromise, settle for a lower grade than I thought that I needed for that position. I'm still fighting it, some 5 years later, but just to get somebody of any worth in the post, I ended up compromising. But I'm still pursuing it because I know what I need. And for me, in the public sector, there are two persons carrying the post of marshal. One is a ceremonial marshal at the University of Technology who is pretty much a mace bearer for ceremonial events. My marshal is a totally different post, but they cannot appreciate what the marshal does, even though I went to the trouble of going some time ago, some years ago, CPA had done a study on what sergeants of arms do in different jurisdictions. And I went to the trouble of extracting the things that we wanted our marshal to do. And it was to no avail because they just cannot understand that parliamentary posts are not like every other post. So those are some of the challenges that we encounter when we don't have this administration separation of powers and autonomy. Administrative autonomy is about the right of Parliament to take decisions regarding the services it needs and the means of achieving this. Parliament is not an extension of the government and should not be treated as such. Parliament is in the best position to determine its own needs, which in some instances differ substantially from that of a ministry or other mainstream operation, which they seek to superimpose on Parliament. Autonomous parliaments is now the accepted principle for best practice. This has been recently a recommendation of the World Bank, of a World Bank report on the strengthening of oversight in the Jamaican Parliament. One of the more successful models is that of establishing a corporate management structure for the Parliament. Let us call it a board. The board would be chaired by the Speaker, with representation by all parties in the House, and the clerk as secretary to the board. The clerk as accounting officer would be responsible for managing the resources, having regard to the strategic priorities set by the board. Best practice also dictates that an independent parliamentary service should be established based on the principle of merit. Terms and conditions of employment should be based on the needs of the legislature and not on the dictates of the public service. Like any other recipient of public funds, the Parliament must adhere to the highest standards of accountability. The clerk should have ultimate financial responsibility for the legislature, and the clerk would therefore be required to institute financial controls and report to the board at regular intervals. And the clerk would also be required to have an annual audit of the accounts undertaken and report to Parliament. At the institutional level, autonomy may be established by legislation or by resolution of the House. The former, it is submitted, would be more effective both in terms of impact and sustainability. And just to say, oversight will not be effective if Parliament is subject to the control of the executive, and the recommendation would be for the independence of the Parliament, and just under the principle that Parliament, as a self-regulating body, should be self-regulating in its own management. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Cooke. The floor is now open to questions.
Does the CPA have a model that it recommends for governments who wish to make this change to make Parliament autonomous?
All right, this is a report, Administration and Financing of Parliament. It's a 2005 study. So they went through, they had, as usual, they have persons from different jurisdictions taking part in the study and sharing their own experiences, and then they came up with what would be the best way to go about it. So they did make recommendations in this report. Arlene, is it still available? It is. Okay.
Yes, that is still available online. I believe.
So what is in this report would be the model for best practice, and I think what it boils down to is a corporate structure, a board or whatever you want to call it. In Canada, they call it the Board of Internal Economy. They have a structure in the UK Parliament, New Zealand, India. They are autonomous. They have this board that governs Parliament, and they look about their own corporate services, all their different activities, and they're not subject to any dictates of a Ministry of Finance or whatever their counterpart is. So
what I was looking for was actual legislative model which facilitates the best practice.
Right. Well, they have like the Canada Act, and I know Barbados has a Parliament Act which sets out certain things, And, you know, and this is what the speaker from Trinidad says, that by the end of next year, they will have their own Parliament Act in place, whatever the name of it is.
Sorry. When I opened this morning with a welcome, I hinted at some of the issues that we have been having for a long, long time. And we are determined to, this time, make the transition. I was just saying to the speaker that I don't know that we will be able to make the jump from the administration or overall responsibility for the administration of the Legislative Assembly being the remit of the Deputy Governor as head of the public service to the sort of corporate structure that the clerk just outlined. We may have to go to an interim position to start with, given our constitutional status. But we have had highlighted just recently in Finance Committee some of the difficulties inherent in the present arrangement, where the Deputy Governor, as I indicated, is the one to recommend to the Governor what the salaries of the Premier, the Speaker, the members of the House is, while he, of course, his salary is determined by the Governor as well. And it leads to all sorts of nice situations where the Deputy Governor and the Attorney General get paid more than the Premier and the Speaker. But those are just some of the smaller problems. Even issues like constituency allowances and so forth have proven problematic, because they sit there and make judgments on what they think is appropriate without any experience at all about what running a constituency office and being responsible for a constituency actually involves. So we are going to, in fact, I'm about to make a public announcement about how we are planning to proceed. In that respect, I won't do that now, but we are determined to make the shift this time. And I think given what has transpired in the last few weeks in Finance Committee, there is now an acceptance at the upper echelons that we really need to find a better arrangement. It places the Deputy Governor in a curious position where he has to come here in Finance Committee and field questions, and it can be, and as it was, proved to be quite embarrassing in the situation. So that is something that is definitely in the offing. So we'll study with interest your paper and see what we can take from that as we try to move this process forward.
If there are no more questions, I guess that brings us to the end of today's session. Thank you very much. No? Was there another question? Oh, we actually caught up with the time. Thank you very, very much for your cooperation and participation. I hope that we see you all tomorrow. I believe we have a dinner reception tonight. Mm-hmm. Yes, there's a dinner reception tonight, and I hope we see you all there. Thank you very much, and I guess we should thank our two panelists again. Thank you very much.